Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar organized by ODI and DFID and hosted by socialprotection.org. This is the third in a series of webinars on the topic of social protection, women's and girls' outcomes, and gender equality. My name is Francesca Bastagli. I head the Social Protection and Social Policy Program at ODI. Today, we are looking at the question of financing gender responsive social protection. Now, for many of us who work on social protection, and indeed most of the webinars the two past webinars in the series, we tend to focus on the spending side when we talk about social protection. We ask questions about coverage, exclusion in particular. Why are women at a higher risk of exclusion from social protection? We are concerned about issues of adequacy of social protection provision and have discussed how women are, even when they are covered by social protection, tend to receive lower levels of support. Less attention tends to be paid to the financing angle, and that's what we're going to look at today. Importantly, because the levels of resources available to financing social protection matter to women's and girls' outcomes. But also the financing mix, so where these resources come from matter. The levels of revenue, of course, impact on levels of public spending on services that are valuable to women and girls. And poorly resourced public services mean that women and girls may have to will commonly have to step in to fill in the gap through their unpaid or low-paid care work. Policy design choices on revenue collection can lead to lost revenue and untapped resources that directly disadvantage women and girls. When it comes to the financing mix, depending on whether we consider sort of tax finance social protection or contributory social protection, again, there are a range of issues we need to, and we will be discussing I think in depth today around when it comes to taxation, how the incidence of alternative tax instruments will vary across between men and women, the implications of alternative tax instruments for policy sustainability and the political economy of policy. And from the contributory angle, of course, questions around women's participation in paid work, patterns of paid work, and how contributory social protection in its interaction with the labor market and women's patterns of paid employment, how all of that matters to coverage and adequacy. Now, in its joint statement to this year's Commission on the Status of Women, the SPIACB, the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, calls on governments and partners to invest in financing gender-responsive social protection systems to extend their coverage and adequacy. And indeed, the CSW agreed conclusions this year urges stakeholders to take steps to significantly increase investment to close resource gaps and to optimize fiscal expenditures to extend social protection coverage. So, given this background, what are the critical issues, challenges, and opportunities moving forward in this agenda? I'm absolutely delighted to welcome three leading experts and colleagues to discuss these questions with us today. We have Evelyn Astor, Economic and Social Policy Advisor at the International Trade Union Confederation, Karen Groen, Senior Director for Gender at the World Bank, and Flora Miamba, independent expert on social protection in Africa. Now, what we're going to do is each presenter will deliver a brief presentation of around 10 minutes. In the meantime, I hope that those of you that are participating online will send through your questions. So following these 10-minute presentations, we will be opening up to a Q&A, and I will be taking your questions and moving them, presenting them to our panelists, and we will have the opportunity to hear more from them in response to your questions. We will then have a brief closing session. So without further ado, I hand over the mic to Evelyn for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and I'm really delighted to take part in this discussion today. I would really like to start by thanking ODI, DFID, and socialprotection.org for organizing a discussion on such an important topic. And you spoke a little bit about the UN Commission on the Status of Women and the recent conclusions, which called for strengthening access to social protection for women and stepping up resources for social protection. But I think that this webinar is really important because we can delve deeper into how different financing models can really support a more gender equal access to social protection, and also looking at how to leverage the financing that's needed to close the financing gaps. When we talk about financing social protection, we're usually focused on the levels of overall social expenditure, but I think it's really critical to look at the different models for financing. If we can go to the next slide, please. I want to make a point around how the different structures of financing can affect women and men differently. So when it comes to contributory systems, these are systems that tend to be financed through employer and worker contributions. These are really important benefits. They allow workers income security during periods temporarily or permanently out of employment, like unemployment, disability, during periods of maternity, during retirement. They provide a replacement income, and often the benefit level is linked to one's last income. And in the case of pensions, these benefits tend to be also linked to the number of years worked. However, these benefits can often mirror and even exacerbate gender inequalities that exist in the labor market into social protection access. So women, they tend to be lower paid than men. They tend to be less likely in employment, especially formal employment. They have a higher concentration in non-standard forms of work, precarious forms of work. And because of the unequal balance between household and care responsibilities between women and men, they also tend to have greater gaps in their careers because of men, and they tend to work fewer hours than men in formal employment because of care responsibilities. And so all of these gender inequalities in the labor market tend to translate into lower contributions for women, and therefore lower or inexistent entitlements in contributory benefits many times. So according to the ILO, globally only around 25% of women are covered by a contributory old age pension. And they also tend to have significantly lower benefit levels than men. We don't have global estimates on the overall benefit level gaps globally between women and men, but in the EU, for instance, women's pensions tend to amount to around 40% less of men's, and this is most acute in systems that are strongly where contributions are strongly linked to entitlements. That being said, there are ways to mitigate these gender inequalities in contributory schemes. So some countries provide credits for contributions during periods of care for children or sometimes other relatives. So Chile, Korea, and a number of EU countries, they actually allow when a worker is off from work because of caring responsibilities to have that period credited under a contributory scheme. There's the possibility for higher rates of employer contributions or subsidized contributions by the state for those on lower incomes, who, as I mentioned, tend to be women. And that can help workers build up greater contributions and adequate benefits. It's also really important to make sure that employers pay their fair share of contributions within contributory schemes, especially for non-standard forms of work. Sometimes employers are not obliged to do so, and that penalizes women. And then there are ways of introducing redistributive components within contributory systems. So it's possible, for example, to have higher replacement rates, higher benefit levels for workers who worked on low incomes rather than those on high incomes. So, for example, Turkey, they provide nearly a 100% replacement rate in pensions for those who are on low incomes, while around 60% of a little less than 60% for top earners. I should mention that a lot of reforms since the crisis, though, have sought to reduce the redistributive aspects of contributory systems, tightening the link between contributions and entitlements, and obviously this can reinforce gender gaps in terms of access and in terms of benefit levels of contributory schemes. Now, when it comes to non-contributory schemes, so these are often social assistance benefits, guaranteed income support benefits. These are generally financed through general taxation. Since women are ineligible often for contributory benefits, they tend to be overrepresented in the receipt of non-contributory benefits. However, the levels tend to be pretty low. Within OECD countries, only one country pays social assistance benefits above the poverty line. That country is Denmark, and that's only when combining that with housing allowances. Now, non-contributory schemes are also, because they're tax financed, subject to stringent conditionalities. They're often means tested, meaning that if you earn less than a certain amount, you're not eligible for them. And in some countries, this is based on household income, not individual income. So if a woman is in a household where a partner works, the assumption is that that income is shared between them, which is often not the case. And then this has negative consequences in terms of women's eligibility for such benefits and therefore their economic independence. In other cases with non-contributory schemes, like conditional cash transfers, the benefits are tied with specific requirements for taking care of children or taking children to doctor's appointments or taking them to school. But of course, these can sometimes create very large administrative requirements that fall on women, which reinforce their role as a primary caregiver in that household. Now, coverage of social protection tends to be greatest when you have a good combination and sequencing between non-contributory benefits and contributory benefits. And some countries do this really well. A lot of EU countries, for example, have contributory pensions that are combined with a non-contributory pension automatically for those who don't fulfill the contributory criteria. But also in developing contexts, Kenya, for instance, they recently introduced a non-contributory pension to complement the contributory one. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, beyond the financing model, it's really important to look at the overall level of financing. Governments tend to cite a lack of fiscal space as the main reason for not introducing or rolling out comprehensive social protection programs or having higher benefit levels. The ILO, they recently had a general survey on social protection floors where they asked governments what are the barriers to rolling out non-contributory social protection schemes. 46 governments reported that there are economic constraints and problems with the generation and allocation of funds, which are a major barrier to extending benefits. It's also rather concerning that social spending on existing schemes is decreasing in some countries. So a recent edition of the ILO Social Protection Monitor showed that 120 countries are currently contracting their public spending, 82 of which are developing countries. There are different reasons for this. Very often it has to do with demographic aging. So there's a shrinking of the working age population relative to the elderly. And so there are cutbacks in order to compensate for this. Also concerns around sovereign debt. And the way cutbacks usually happen are done in a way that can really disproportionately impact women. So in contributory systems, as I mentioned, there's the tightening the link between the contributions and the entitlement, reducing the redistributive aspects, tightening eligibility criteria for women, eligibility criteria for benefits that women disproportionately use. So for example, survivors benefits or maternity benefits. or social assistance benefits. Also, sometimes reductions in the indexation of benefits, which can disproportionately impact women because they tend to live longer than men. So they're more penalized by pensions, for example, that are not appropriately indexed to take into account inflation and changes to the cost of living. And then cutbacks to overall benefit levels, which can concern women because they tend to be at greater risk of poverty than men already. Despite these financing concerns, there is evidence showing that financing adequate social protection is financially feasible for a lot of countries. It's a question of how you decide to create fiscal space. The FES, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, they have a tool called the Social Protection Index, which estimates the amount of additional GDP that a country would need to raise in order to fill social protection coverage gaps. They estimate that 71 countries could extend non-contributory benefits to all that needed by spending an extra 2% of GDP or less. In a number of countries, it would be more. 54 countries would need to spend 6% or less. And in a couple of countries, it would be rather considerable, around 10% of GDP or more. But these countries are only 13 compared to the vast majority, which actually would not really need to raise so much in order to provide a really critical protection for their people. So how can countries fill financing gaps? So if you go to the next slide, please. Well, I've made mention of the fact that many countries are trying to promote sustainability by focusing on the spending side. However, it's really important also to look at the revenue side, how to mobilize domestic resources. So we held the ITUC, we held a global conference on financing social protection with trade unions, with civil society organizations, with academics, with representatives of the World Bank, the IMF, the ILO, to try to ask this question: how is it possible to create fiscal space? And one of the major points that came up is why are countries not doing more to address underutilized labor supply, especially in the context of demographic aging concerns? 61% of the world's workforce is working in the informal economy. So this is foregone taxation and foregone social security contributions many times, because this work is not declared. So there is space here to look at how to foster the transition from the informal to the formal economy. There's also the issue around addressing really the barriers to women's labor market representation, the barriers to youth employment, barriers to migrants in employment, to really try to create a conducive macroeconomic environment and raise tax revenue. The second has to do with progressivity of taxation, as well as tax evasion. In Africa, illicit financial flows actually account for almost double development assistance. So there's a really considerable concern that many unions, many civil society organizations have been raising around the fact that such leakages in taxation are really an impediment in terms of investment in social spending and critical public services, and that needs to be addressed, as well as looking at progressive forms of taxation like corporate tax, financial transaction taxes, capital gains tax, which in some countries have even diminished over recent years, despite the fact that there are people who have the capacity to pay more that should pay more in order to finance critical benefits and services. The issue around employers' contributions as well. Some countries have actually recently reduced employers' contributions, like Romania. They've almost completely eliminated employers' contributions while raising it for workers, but this has clear concerns with regard to the sustainability of social security systems. And so the question is raised, why are employers' contributions being cut back when there are demographic aging concerns and pension sustainability concerns? The reallocation of public expenditures as well. There were some really good examples in the conference of countries that have decided to prioritize social spending over other areas. For example, Egypt, which eliminated its fossil fuel subsidies and instead reallocated that money towards social programs. So there are also sometimes it's not about raising new revenue, it's just about reallocating. And finally, the role of development overseas development assistance needs to be acknowledged as well, especially for those countries where the cost of financing would be too high for them to do on their own, especially low-income countries. On average, OECD DAC countries spend only 0.3% of their gross national income on development assistance, even though there have been many international commitments made in the UN system to spend, and within the OECD to spend at least 0.7% of gross national income. So these commitments could give low and middle income countries some leverage to also negotiate increased transfers to set up and improve social protection schemes. But at the end of the day, of course, the responsibility for raising revenue, for raising expenditure falls on states, but of course the international community can help. So to conclude, I just want to point out a couple of reports that the ITUC has recently done where you can find more information. Because of the limited time, I did not go into many country examples, a lot of statistics, but the reports that we have, for example, on gender gaps in social protection really do provide more detail. So the link is provided in the slide here for that brief. In the next slide, you'll also see the brief that we recently did on pension sustainability. It's called Adequacy and Sustainability of Pensions in the Context of Demographic Aging, looking at a lot of pension reforms to promote sustainability and the impacts that they've had on women and other groups, and what can be done to promote sustainability, but also adequacy in a fair way. And finally, the final conference report for the global conference that I mentioned on financing social protection. You can find all of the conclusions and recommendations on your screen. And I will hand it back to the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Thanks, very interesting. I'll hand over right away to Karen. The floor is yours.
Can you all hear me? Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for organizing this seminar. I'd also like to, or webinar, I'd also like to thank ODI and DFID and my fellow panelists on this panel. I thought I would address in my presentation 3 questions, which really focuses more on the revenue side than on the expenditure side, although I'll touch a little bit on the interlinkage between both. The questions are, what is the role for taxation in financing social protection? What are some of the implications of the balance of different types of tax instruments for equity, in particular gender equity? And then what are some of the challenges as well as the opportunities to improve gender equity or the fairness of the system in general? So let me start by saying that in response to the first question, what is the role for taxation? Taxation is a really important source of revenue for most governments. It's the largest source of own source revenue. There's many different types of revenue that governments have, including income, for instance, from parastatals. There's grants, there's foreign assistance, development assistance, and so forth. But taxes are the largest own source revenue for governments. And investment through the tax system actually signals important governmental priorities. Now, there's different types of taxes that governments have at their disposal. There's taxes, the largest share of taxes actually comes from taxes on consumption, value-added taxes, excise taxes, import duties, and export taxes. There's about 166 countries that have some form of VAT, value-added tax, in 2016. This has been the type of tax that has grown most significantly in the past 20 years. And countries like Malaysia, Tanzania, Egypt, India have really increased their value-added taxes. There's also taxes on labor income. These are wage taxes, and as we just heard, Social Security taxes. Finally, there's taxes on business and investment income. There's wealth and inheritance taxes. And when we go down to the local level, there's taxes that municipal entities impose on property or on land. There's also newer forms of tax instruments. These are green taxes, which I think we'll hear about in the next session. We've heard about financial transaction taxes, which some countries implement nationally, and there's been some move to think about imposing those at the global level. There's a lot of differences between developed and emerging market and low income countries, between the emphasis on these different tax instruments. The differences have to do with revenue differences. So for instance, revenues in many low and middle income countries, of course, are much lower than they would be in higher income and emerging market countries. There's different countries, developed countries have a different mix of different types of taxes. So for instance, taxes on labor income are much higher in the developed countries than they are in the developing countries. Developing countries have a much higher share of their tax revenue from indirect taxes, the taxes I mentioned, value added and excise types of taxes. The factors that influence the relative mix of different instances not only have to do with revenue considerations, the difference between, who's in formal employment, informal employment, they also have to do with administrative considerations, the ability of a government to be able to tax. So tax capacity, administrative capacity varies quite considerably across countries. And finally, a principle of tax policy is fairness. Governments do try to balance what they call the 3 E's, the ability for efficiency, the ability to get as much revenue as possible out of the system, equity, which is the fairness consideration. And then, of course, there's the most important point, I think, is that taxes are always in a political system, and there's always political considerations about the ability to tax. So one thing before I conclude on this part about, what is the role of taxation in terms of and the different instruments and the ability to tax. There's some trends in tax reform that I think are important for people on the seminar and this webinar to know about. There has been, as I mentioned, increased reliance on value-added taxes. Over the past 25 years, there has been quite a lot of pressure to reduce certain types of taxes that have been important, particularly for lower income countries, like trade taxes. So many developing countries have actually reduced trade taxes. There has been, as we heard, increased competition, what we call tax competition, for foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. This increased tax competition puts a lot of pressure on countries to reduce their levels of taxation, and this is particularly problematic. A key trend in all countries over the last 25 years has been reductions in the individual income tax system in the top tax rates in the US alone. This has been really quite apparent. And this has a lot of implications, I think, for inequality and equity, which I'll come to in just a minute. There's also been a number of trends which is related to the tax competition issue in top tax rates on business and corporate taxes. And this is a really, I think, problematic issue, and I'll come back to that at the end. So let me talk a little bit now about how we would think about equity and equity of different types of taxes, particularly gender equity. And there's different ways to think about equity. The first is vertical equity, which is the progressivity of the system. And then the second way is to think about horizontal equity, which is being able to tax the ability to have equity across within a particular income bracket or a particular tax bracket across different types of households or different types of individuals in a particular bracket. So for instance, horizontal equity, we might think about the differences between households that have one earner and different dependents versus households that have dual earners. So trying to assess equity across different household types. The other thing I think in terms of thinking about equity is in the end, while we focus on equity within the tax system, the idea would be to, we need to look at the balance when we think about equity overall between equity on the revenue side and equity on the expenditure side. So just to give you a quick example from some work that the Women's Budget Group has done in the UK, when the UK has made the decision to reduce its fiscal deficit, they can do so through cutting expenditure, as we have just heard, or by raising taxes. And often the balance is on cutting the expenditure side as opposed to raising the taxes side. And we need to assess from that perspective who gains in terms of that balance, and that's quite important, the balance between public expenditure and the balance between net revenue collection. It's really hard, I have to say, to assess the gender equity implications of taxes and benefits. And the reasons are because of differences in earnings, differences in sources of income of different household members, differences in household needs, and of course, as we heard earlier, there's different roles that men and women play in the economy in any different parts of time. And part of the issue about why it's so difficult to assess gender equity is we lack a lot of data. Ideally, to be able to assess the gender implications of different types of taxes, for instance, of income taxes, we need individual level data, which we don't have in many countries. To assess the implications of the VAT. We also need a lot more disaggregated data, for instance, data on firms, male-owned firms, female-owned firms. And we need this data that is actually disaggregated by income quintiles or income deciles, so the poorest versus the richest households. I was involved in a project a few years ago that did try to assess the gender implications of different types of taxes, and I have to say that we came up with some very creative methods of getting around the data problems, where we assessed the burden of different types of households, we call them household types, based on their status as male breadwinner households or female breadwinner households, or households that have more adult males or more adult females in them, because we don't have the individual level. And one of the things I think I should say is that when we actually found, what we actually found is that when you look at things like income taxes, there actually are different burdens of different types of households. So single female earner households do, in some countries, bear a higher tax burden than dual earner households or male earner households. There's not a clear story that emerges across countries. Each country, I think, is so unique that it's difficult to tell a global story. And of course, it's a partial story because the equity implications of different types of taxes are only partial. You have to put the whole thing together to come up with an important picture. And here I want to say what are then move into some of the questions about how do we actually do this? Well, I think we need to actually think about investing more in evidence and data collection. We have to actually, there's some simple fixes that can be done for different types of taxes. For instance, in the income tax system, we need to look at the codes. We need to actually ask whether there's explicit bias in the codes. For instance, as in Morocco, which types of are female heads of household or female breadwinners allowed to claim the same types of income exemptions, deductions, and allowances as male types of households. That's an explicit type of bias that might be reformed in the system. There's some simple things that we need to do in revenue administrations when they collect information. They need to add the sex of the filer. There are those kinds of issues that are really important. The value-added taxes, which I want to spend a little bit of time on, are a particularly important, as I mentioned, source of revenue. Here, the issue is not so much the individual, it's about the type of goods and services that are actually taxed. And in the work that we did, the type of goods and services that are either exempt or zero rated in a VAT system are particularly important for women as they are for the poor in general. And there's baskets of goods of services, for instance, like certain types of fuel, paraffin expenses, or there might be certain types of goods and services that are important for women versus men, for instance, food, different types of food, that should be really part of a basket of goods for the poor overall, that if they're zero rated or exempt, will have gender equity considerations. I know my time is short. I want to just go into the question of back to the general picture, what are some of the issues of challenges and opportunities to improve fairness and to improve revenue raising in the system. There's a lot of challenges right now, as I had mentioned, in terms of actually keeping the progressivity of tax systems. I mentioned that many governments are, because of tax competition, because of pressures on the deficit, try to keep rates low. There's a lot of issues right now with the rise of populism and anti-government sentiments that's putting pressure on the system. There are the issues of corporate taxation that I think are particularly troubling right now, and corporations have a great ability to shift taxes. We need a new approach to international corporate taxation to deal with tax shifting across countries. Even the IMF has come on board on rethinking international corporate taxation. So I think this is particularly important. Another challenge that is important is the rise of technology, digital finance, digital services has really important implications for government's ability to tax the VAT, but also on corporate taxation. The VAT digitization has the potential to give tax authorities better information, but some of the challenges include the fact that there's quite a lot of turnover in the system, businesses that can use the gig economy to also hide revenues. Cross-border trade is quite important as a challenge, particularly when it comes to services taxation. It's really hard to track those flows, and that's really important. The other thing I wanted to say is that because of the digitization and the cross-border flows, the burden of taxation, the mobility is so important. It means that the burden of taxation actually goes to the sources of income that are immobile, and that goes to people. And when we think about the income, that's why an income tax system is also so important, but we need to have the progressivity in the system and the ability to tax high income earners in the systems. So there's a number of challenges. I think from where I sit, the issues are really not simple. I think the political dialogue is difficult and it's contentious at the moment. And I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us to move forward to get to an agreement on an international system that works. Then governments, of course, have their own political considerations to get to a national domestic framework for raising revenue that also works. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for highlighting the role, the critical role taxation plays, some of the trends, including the challenges countries face in raising revenue and the types of options they're moving towards, their equity implications, and also the challenges we face in any also even basic incidence analysis and trying to understand the incidence of alternative taxes, or indeed this tax and transfer system as a whole, which, as you say, is what we would want to know more about. Thank you very much. I'll hand over, Flora, to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you once again for the organizers for organizing this very important discussion. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm grateful to be part of the discussion and to be part of the panel team. And so I'm glad Evelyn and Karen as well went ahead of me, and lots has been already described, discussed, and presented. But my role is to present to you or to discuss with you 4 important questions, which includes looking at the reasons, like why and how alternative social protection financing instruments matter to women and gender equality generally, but also to look at the challenges and opportunities in financing gender responsive social protection, particularly looking at the challenges faced by the informal economy or informal sector. And then I'll highlight some of the tax transfer system challenges to the gender responsive social protection financing. And then I was asked to provide some examples. And as I've been introduced, my work has been more in Africa, looking at the issues of social protection and gender equality, women's economic empowerment in Africa, particularly the developing countries, south of Sahara, Africa south of Sahara, but also some other developing countries in the world. And so my discussion is complementing the previous discussants, but also looking at what particularly has been challenging or continue to challenge these developing countries. So next slide, please, and the other slide. So I will start by looking at the first question, where is, next slide, please. Where, as I have mentioned already, the why question. Why do we think it's important to have alternative social protection financing? So generally, I want to remind you or to inform you the fact that women in the informal sector are actually overrepresented, in the sense that when we talk about informal economy, we have more women in this sector than men. And as an example, in south of Asia, we have 80% of women in the informal sector, but also south of Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, we do have 74%. These are quite high numbers, and that's why we term it as overrepresentation of this group of the population in the informal sector. But then I want to highlight the fact that this is not just by chance. Can you please move to the next slide? This is not just by choice. They're not choosing to be overrepresented in this sector. Another slide, please. but it's due to the gendered factors that they have been experiencing for a long time. And this includes the unpaid care work, particularly domestic work. We all know in the African setup, most of the domestic care work has been on the shoulders of women, which excludes them or leads them into the exclusion in the labor market. But also you can consider the time burden that they do face and they continue to face by being in this informal economy. And a lot of characters or implications or consequences faced include a lot of or high levels of marginalization, but also exploitation in their work, job insecurities, low wages. As I mentioned, Evelyn has already highlighted most of these aspects: limited access to financial services, but also literacy, the high fertility rates, low access to regulations, and low just knowing where is the law, what does the law say, what is my right, what is my deserved right that I can fight for or fight against, and all these, but also limited access to ownership, which generally define or characterize these women into the very high levels of poverty. And in the sense, when we're talking about social protection, non-contributory social protection, for example, you see that more beneficiaries will fall into this women category, into the women part or category of the population, because automatically we have large numbers or high numbers of extreme poor levels. They're single mothers, they have large families, and so they fall into that category. But then the last aspect in these challenges, that like what happens after that, then we end up with a group that we call a group of many women who are in extreme poverty, but they do not qualify for to receive benefits or to receive non-contributory social protection or coverage, because maybe they're trying to work hard to build their lives, to build their daily economy, and they're doing business work, maybe very low scale business work. But at the same time, these people are not earning enough to be able to contribute in the social protection. And so Evelyn highlighted the differences between contributory and non-contributory. Now these large groups of women fall in between, where they cannot contribute, they don't earn enough to contribute, but they cannot qualify to be in the extreme poor category in one way or another. And therefore we term them as a missing middle category. And as I have mentioned, since we have large numbers of this group, this means that we need to look for alternative financing in social protection. And particularly, again, as Evelyn mentioned, the need to have the two categories meet, where you have expanded contributory social protection through ensuring that even those people in the informal sector are able to contribute enough for them to benefit in the future. We expand that coverage, but at the same time be able to expand the non-contributory, which is already provided in the so through non-contributory social protection. And so by so doing, we are ensuring larger coverage to this population. If we can go to the next slide, please. So going to I'll actually, for number one, I'll discuss the how, providing alternative towards the end of the presentation. But now I wanted to look at the challenges that these women face and the opportunities that they could have. So the first one is the general absence of the right-based social protection. The fact that not all countries recognize or practice social protection is based on rights theory, or categorizing it, or viewing it, or implementing it as something that these beneficiaries have a right for. And therefore, we look for opportunities, for instance, to cover such women who are missing the benefits out of this social protection through universal social protection. So this is one of the strategies, for instance, to address this gap. As Evelyn mentioned earlier, the fact that these women have not been contributing, they don't have an opportunity to contribute now. It means that in the end, when they grow old, they won't have an opportunity to benefit. But it's not that they were not working, it's just that they did not have the opportunity to contribute so that they can receive later. Therefore, if governments think or consider or make an emphasis to develop universal social protection strategies, that will help to mitigate, to address this gap. But also the issue of policy is one very important and very strong. With that, it goes the fiscal strategy and budgeting for social protection generally. Now, we haven't moved into very gender-specific social protection policies yet. Just generally, the social protection has not looked much like the gender aspect in the social protection has been missing and continue to be missing in many social protection programs. Just to remind, social protection programs are geared, or the primary goal is poverty alleviation. And so we need to have very specific targeted strategies to ensure that gender aspects are included with all the benefits and factors that go with it. And I'll highlight a few in a little bit. But also there has been already discussion on the donor vis-a-vis national financed social protection, and that huge gap. And so we are looking at why we are missing, why are we having this gap that has people that are uncovered when they were supposed to be covered. Look at how many social protection programs are generally donor financed, particularly the social assistance or non-contributory social protection are largely not financed by the government. And therefore there is that gap that needs to be addressed. But also uncertain contributions, because when we're talking about social protection, we're talking about both contributory and non-contributory. And we do understand that contributory has to be contributed, of course, by the worker together with the employer. Now, when you have a large group of these women in the informal sector, it means that they're missing that contribution, in the sense that even when some countries, including Tanzania, for instance, have developed this what they call supplementary contribution, or a strategy where these non-formal workers can contribute themselves and earn at some point. But there's been a lot of challenges highlighted out of that initiative, including uncertainties or being unable to keep the regular contribution for these women. And so they're missing, like we are missing the strategies there, but unfortunately is not able to be expanded. It's not expanding. It's not working in the pace that it was expected due to lots of challenges. Can we move to the next slide, please? But I also want to highlight at the same time the initiatives, or like the emphasis by ILO that the need to transition from informal to the formal, which needs commitment, but there is also some work to do that. But that is one of the strategies as well. Now, answering my third question on how gender biases in existing tax transfer systems can pose a challenge, I just want to highlight to the fact that social protection programs are generally not designed with the gender equality or women's economic empowerment lens. Generally, as I mentioned earlier, these are social protection, poverty alleviation programs. So there has to be a certain push, a certain recognition and understanding and discussion early on. But that again starts with the policy, and it trickles down to the design of these programs to the implementation stage. Now, by missing this, we are missing some positive effects that have been documented in other countries, including the opportunity for these beneficiaries to have long-term assets, but also credit, access to credits and decision making, and so forth. all these are examples of benefits that gender responsive social protection programs can make their beneficiaries benefit out of that. The next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to highlight just a few examples of countries that have done their best, or at least they made a strategy to look at or to address the issues of gender equality and women's economic empowerment. And Ethiopia is one of them. The main goal to support women's roles in agriculture has been key, and it has facilitated in the economic empowerment of women. But we have Ghana as well, Bangladesh, Mexico, and I don't want to go into the details of these programs, but just to highlight as examples of programs that have done well within Africa and beyond that we can learn from. Although there has been challenges, we cannot say that these programs go without challenges, but at least they have made some great steps towards that. PSSN program in Tanzania. I keep giving this example is I'm from Tanzania, and I've seen it grow from one phase or one stage to another, whereby during the design there wasn't much, or there wasn't a look at the issues of gender, but slowly following the challenges that they were facing during pilot with giving cash to men, they started changing and giving this cash to the women so that women can manage the cash on behalf of the household. And we have seen some improvements, but recently also there has been assessments in this program in Tanzania where the discovery that the documented challenges, including work burdens and all these unintended consequences by giving cash to the women, but also the fact that this was not originally designed as a gender program, but at least there has been some progress. There was a recommendation to develop a gender action plan, and which has been developed as we speak, and it has been included in the next phase of the implementation of this program. And for including it, there is a guarantee of being budgeted in the implementation. And so I take this as an example of saying that it's not too late yet. We can still make things happen. We missed it in the beginning, but that doesn't mean that we cannot address such a miss. And this is one of the examples. Can we move to the next slide, please? So I was also asked to provide some of the examples in terms of policy and program reforms. Together with what I have already mentioned, we do have some countries, including Tanzania and Swaziland, that have considered reforming their policy in terms of extending social protection or universal coverage to the elderly, but also these other countries, Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, Namibia, Zambia as well. They have done some very great reforms in terms of identifying and recognizing the benefits of domestic workers and making sure that they do address their concerns, but also job securities, the benefits that they get, and so forth. So at least it's a good step, and there are programs that we can also, programs and policies that we can also learn from. And so maybe just to emphasize on this, changes must or should happen at the policy level, but also at the program level. Because in developing countries, it's very common that things can be spelled out very nicely in the policy, but that does not necessarily mean that they'll be reflected or considered in the program design. But in the implementation as well, it's not a guarantee that it will go as it was designed. So any reforms need to go to be ensured that they happen from the policy level, program design, program implementation, even monitoring and evaluation stages. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I do have more examples of countries that have done well in terms of coverage of the informal economy. And again, we do have Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa that have extended social protection coverage in terms of health insurance, but also in terms of non-contributory pension schemes generally. So we can learn a lot of best practices out of what these countries have done. Let's move to the next one. So I wanted to now respond to the second part of the first question that had asked about how we can at least consider or think of alternative financing mechanisms in terms of social protection coverage. And so again, my previous panelists have highlighted some of these options, but my role here is to also give some examples of countries that have made a great attempt and have made a step, and they continue to work on. And so reprioritizing expenditures is one of the examples. Also, Evelyn mentioned about Egypt and what they have done now to just like take revenues or use revenues from one source and then particularly focusing it on the other. We do have some, Costa Rica is another example, and Thailand is another example, but we also have countries that have taxed harmful products and behaviors like cigarettes and so forth. Philippines has used some tax financing into national child development programs. And so it's some natural resources as well in Zambia, Bolivia, but also Brazil. And so we do see some countries that have moved a step ahead. What I want to emphasize here, I think it's largely the commitment, government commitment into this financing. It's not that it cannot be done, it can be done, but how do governments commit to making sure that they tap some of the benefits of these resources, and particularly focus it in the implementation of social protection, because resources can be there, but what it is used for, again, it's up to the government. The final slide, please. Okay, so just as a way forward, it's important that we have gender responsive social protection for girls and women at all stages. So when we talk about life course, from very early stage to the very elderly stage, it is important that we know that you cannot address one stage in life of these women and girls and leave the other. So we have to always design programs that can think about continuity and sustainability and ensuring that we are dealing with a package in helping these girls and the other categories of vulnerable populations in our society. So I think I'll end there, and let's talk more as we respond to some of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flora. Thank you for highlighting the informality challenge, but also examples of how that can be and has been addressed through policy reform, and also for emphasizing the need to combine both contributory and non-contributory social protection if we are to achieve progress towards universal social protection. So thank you so much. We've covered a lot of issues. We have also been receiving a number of questions. So given the remaining time, what I suggest I do is I will read out the main questions we've received, and then hand the floor back to each of the three speakers to choose which ones they will respond to, if that's all right. Also because some of them, refer to things that each of you have touched upon to some degree. One of the key questions was, links back to what Flora has just been talking about on informality and the challenges and also opportunities for extending social protection, not just non-contributory, but also contributory social protection to informal workers. So I think that question has been partly addressed, but I'll open that, in any case, put that back to the panel in case we want to share more information or examples on how social protection, including, as I say, contributory contributions finance social protection can be expanded to informal women workers in the informal economy. A second question concerns is directly linked to the tax question, and one of the points Karen touched upon. In some sense, Karen, you mentioned anti-government sentiment, and linked to that in some sense, the willingness to pay taxes is. In some contexts, we may be seeing a reduction in that. What can we do about that, right? If given the central role taxation does play, and frankly in many ways probably should play in financing social protection provision, what can we do if willingness to pay tax is low? What are the options there? A third question is around. Well, it starts from the observation that a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about gender equality, inequality in social protection, both coverage and adequacy, a lot of it is the result of inequalities in the labor market and in the world of work and paid work in particular. Then the question points to the robustness of existing contributory systems and asks what role is there for programs such as salary subsidy programs. Again, both Evelyn and Flora brought that up, but perhaps you could come back to that and tell us a bit more about these types of schemes and the extent to which they've worked in practice. A final question before I hand things back to you is, a member of, a participant has asked, should we really just be discussing these gender inequalities in terms of policy design, so social protection or tax and financing design? Can we think about addressing inequality just through this, or do we actually need to look at wider imbalances in the distribution of opportunities? So I'll hand back, and I think, Karen, why don't you take this, have a first go at responding, and then we'll pass over to Flora and then to Evelyn.
Great. It's a really good question in terms of how do we actually take on this issue of anti-government sentiment and unwillingness to pay. I mean, I think there's probably multiple responses for that, and I'd be interested also in hearing Evelyn and Flora's responses. I think the first thing is that we have to increase trust in the government. We have to increase governments have to increase their capacity to deliver social protection and other necessary public services to their people, and they have to do it in a way that is fully inclusive, that really gets the people at the bottom, and in ways that services are designed to really meet people's needs. So there is a huge, I think, impetus to ensure that the revenues that governments raise are being channeled and utilized well. So I think that's particularly important. I think that, and that's difficult in many contexts, and investing in the capability of government systems. We sometimes forget about, the necessity of having really well-trained public civil servants who can be supported and are supported to do the jobs that they are hired to do. I think that there's a number of other things that are really important in terms of being able, in terms of increasing the ability to raise revenue. I think addressing, and other people have spoken about this, the inequalities in the labor market for females, in ensuring that women are able to participate in decent jobs in the workforce is going to be really important for the tax side of the equation. There's some really kind of interesting, I'm not sure I believe it, experimental literature that shows that women are more tax compliant than men. I think that that essentializes women in a certain way that may not be accurately right. It may be that women just don't know how to take advantage of all the loopholes, and they don't have the literacy in the system. But I think that, I wouldn't go with those kinds of arguments, but I do think that it's really important. The last thing I want to say that I think is also really important is we need to have the right measures of accountability. I really believe in the kind of projects like the international budget and policy projects, the ability of citizen groups to hold governments accountable for where their money is going. I think that's a bit of a troubled terrain right now because there's a divide. People, the tax conversations are also are seen often as a very technical conversation, hard for people to understand. You get into the details, but I think there's a really important role for citizen advocates to do tax literacy, along the kinds of work that we are seeing being done by Citizens for Tax Justice and other organizations like that to demystify. And I think, funders, private foundations have a responsibility to support those movements for transparency and accountability. And ultimately, I have to say that when I think about this from the perspective of gender, being here in Vancouver at the Women Deliver conference, where there's just a huge backlash in general against women's rights. The women's movement hasn't always taken on these financial issues in ways that they need to, and get involved in the more macro public finance kinds of conversations. And I really think this is really quite important for the next wave of activism.
Thank you, Karen. Flora.
Okay, thank you. I think really looking at the question on how to expand social protection to the informal sector, I think it's a case by case kind of in a way that we really need to understand what is happening. We know generally what is happening, or like all these challenges that are faced by the informal sector generally. But as Evelyn mentioned earlier, the fact that men and women experience issues differently and they have specific needs, I think where to start would be to understand what has been happening, what are the specific challenges in terms of what will be the specific needs or demands for these different groups in different countries. And I'm saying this because even with the examples that I've given, Tanzania, for instance, having this supplementary scheme where informal sectors can contribute. There is a study that we had conducted, I think it was 4 years ago, to just understand why is it that there is this scheme and still people cannot contribute. The number is still very low of contributors. We had a lot of issues. Some would start, given that that's the only, maybe the main source, the business, whatever small business that they're doing is the main source of their livelihoods. Anything that happens, be it sickness, remember these people don't have health insurance coverage and all these other income challenges where they just rely on that small amount that they can benefit out of that. And so they can start contributing at a certain point, and then they end there, they cannot continue. There are some schemes that have also health insurance component. So when you contribute as former employee, then there is a benefit that you get, health insurance benefit that you get, but that is renewable every year. So they can, for instance, be able to contribute and benefit for this year, but they can no longer contribute for next year. And so all these other challenges happen to them. So I think if we can understand very specifically the issues around them, for instance, in the end, register them, have specific registration for them, and also provided the government provide a certain subsidy for them in the way that they can support and help them contribute time to time. I think that will be one of the because they're really willing to contribute. It's just that they're failing, they cannot contribute. So support them, help them register, start something, and support that thing, have them continue that way. But also the universal coverage that we were discussing about, I think that is another strategy where you can consider that, make them work, but also have these other benefits along with it. I think I would just say that I'm not expert much in the taxes, But I think, as you mentioned, Karen, government commitment to what they really want to know. I think the very first point to start is understanding the need and the importance and how that can benefit. Like you are investing here, and how much can you benefit out of that? I think there is a big miss of that knowledge and understanding, because commitment sometimes comes also out of understanding. If you don't get it, it's not very easy to commit in something that you don't have that very full understanding of that. And sometimes these things go politically, and we cannot deny that role of politics in this, but we need to have very good champions within the government, within programs, to have these move, including knowledge and like understanding what they can benefit, because otherwise it sounds like it's a waste, unless you convince me, but unless you make that use of whatever evidence that's there.
Thank you, Flora. Evelyn, I'll hand over to you for final words.
Thanks a lot. First of all, I would really like to build on Flora's point that you know, informal economy workers, they often want to contribute, but they're not able to contribute. And a really good example of this is in Rwanda, where moto taxi drivers they tried to actually come together and unionize. They created a sort of a cooperative union hybrid where they could actually register themselves and actually then be able to contribute into the social security system so that they would have access to employment injury benefits. Another really good example is Uruguay, which when they streamlined their process for registering businesses and paying and having taxes paid for small businesses, and at the same time have people come in and register for Social Security. When they streamlined that procedure through the monotax system, they were able to bring in an enormous amount of people who were previously informal into the formal economy and be able to access contributory benefits. So I don't think, there's often this misconception that they don't want to pay taxes and contribute, but sometimes it's really the procedural setting and the recognition of the government of their work that makes it possible. So I think increasing the possibilities to formalize and to declare one's activities and to partake in the contributory system is really important. We also need to acknowledge that non-contributory benefits can be really critical as well in order to reach people who have been left out and who have fragmented or incomplete contribution histories. So it's really important to look at strengthening access to the contributory while also having a strong non-contributory. I think when it comes to the issues around gender inequality outside of, well, gender equality in the labor market, gender inequality in terms of distribution of household responsibilities, this is obviously very clearly linked to gender gaps in social protection. And it's true, a lot of this discussion and a lot of my presentation focused on how can you reduce biases in social security systems and make social protection systems more inclusive, mitigating the disadvantage that women face. But of course, this is not going to solve the whole problem unless you also look at how to reduce gender inequalities in the labor market and how to reduce gender inequalities in terms of the distribution of care and household responsibilities. And here, you know, anti-discrimination measures in the labor market are really essential. Pay transparency measures, and enforcement, by the way, of equal pay legislation, investment in formal care services also for elderly or sick dependents are important, because the literature shows that women overwhelmingly take responsibility for care and adjust their labor market patterns and drop out of the labor market or take jobs that are more flexible in order to compensate for caring relatives. So access to formal care is really critical. And an issue very close to my heart has to do with gender balance of leave and making paid paternity and parental leave possible, and not just maternity leave, because this really sets up the distribution of care at the moment that a child is born. and it's really important in terms of re-equalizing care responsibilities in a household. So this is really essential if you want to address gender inequalities in social protection. You need to prevent these inequalities from happening by reducing gender inequalities in the labor market, and then you need to mitigate by adjusting the system as well in order to take care of women who were disadvantaged but now need to benefit now from social protection. So maybe one last thing on tax before concluding. I absolutely agree with Karen that trust in the government and trust in the way that money is spent is really important. But also, I think that it becomes more palatable to agree to pay tax when you think that the tax structure is done in a fair way. And in some countries like Brazil, Oxfam reported last year that the bottom 10% actually pay a greater share of their income in tax than the top 10%. So progressivity in taxation, I think, is also key in order to make this palatable and acceptable from a societal viewpoint.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you so much. Thank you to all three speakers for highlighting, well, first of all, how important it is that we look not just at spending when we think about social protection, but at how it's funded. If we care about well, equity outcomes more generally, but importantly also for women. Thank you for reminding us, I think the audience and everyone that when we think about raising revenue, well, taxation matters in terms of raising revenue, but also has distributional and equity implications. And so we need to remember to discuss revenue raising efforts in terms of their equity implications. And then for providing, identifying what are the, some of the key issues we are grappling with when it comes to financing challenges and opportunities. But also providing examples of ways forward and how important it is that we consider both contributory and non-contributory financing opportunities. Thank you to all three. Evelyn, have a good afternoon. Flora, a good evening to you. Karen, have a lovely day ahead. We're all with you in spirit in Vancouver. Thanks to our audience. There is a recording, there will be a recording made available of this webinar, as well as supporting material that will be made available on the socialprotection.org website. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.